The Thin Man by Dashiell Hammett, Chapter 31. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I let myself into our apartment at the Normandy. Nora, Dorothy, and Larry Crowley were in the living room. Nora and Larry playing backgammon, Dorothy reading a newspaper. "Did Macaulay really kill them?" Nora asked immediately. "Yes. Did the morning papers have anything about Wynant?" Dorothy said, "No, just about Macaulay being arrested. Why?" "Macaulay killed him, too." Nora said, "Really?" Larry said, "I'll be damned." Dorothy began to cry. Nora looked at Dorothy in surprise. Dorothy sobbed, "I want to go home to Mama." Larry said, not very eagerly, "I'll be glad to take you home if—" Dorothy said she wanted to go. Nora fussed over her, but did not try to talk her out of going. Larry, trying not to look too unwilling, found his hat and coat. He and Dorothy left. Nora shut the door behind them and leaned against it. "Explain that to me, Mr. Charlimbides," she said. I shook my head. She sat on the sofa beside me. "Now out with it. If you skip a single word, I'll have to have a drink before I could do any talking." She cursed me and brought me a drink. "Has he confessed?" "Why should he? You can't plead guilty of murder in the first degree. There were too many murders, and at least 2 of them were too obviously done in cold blood for the district attorney to let him plead guilty of second-degree murder. There's nothing for him to do but fight it out." "But he did commit them." "Sure." She pushed my glass down from my mouth. "Stop stalling and tell me about it." "Well, it figures out that he and Julia had been jipping Wynant for some time. He dropped a lot of money in the market, and he'd found out about her past as Morelli hinted, and the pair of them teamed up on the old man. We're sticking accountants on Macaulay's books and Wynant's and shouldn't have much trouble tracing some of the loot from one to the other." "Then you don't know positively that he was robbing Wynant?" "Sure we do. It doesn't click any other way. The chances are Wynant was going away on a trip the 3rd of October because he did draw $5,000 out of the bank in cash, but he didn't close up his shop and give up his apartment. That was done by Macaulay a few days later. Wynant was killed at Macaulay's in Scarsdale on the night of the 3rd. We know that because on the morning of the 4th, when Macaulay's cook who slept at home came to work, Macaulay met her at the door with some kind of trumped-up complaint and 2 weeks' wages and fired her on the spot, not letting her in the house to find any corpses or bloodstains." "How did you find that out? Don't skip details." "Ordinary routine. Naturally, after we grabbed him, we went to his office and house to see what we could find out. You know, where were you on the night of June 6, 1894 stuff. And the present cook said she'd only been working for him since the 8th of October, and that led to that. We also found a table with a very faint trace of what we hope is human blood not quite scrubbed out. The scientific boys are making shavings of it now to see if they can soak out any results for us. It turned out to be beef blood." "Then you're not sure he—" "Stop saying that. Of course we're sure. That's the only way it clicks. Wynant had found out that Julia and Macaulay were jipping him and also thought rightly or wrongly that Julia and Macaulay were cheating on him, and we know he was jealous. So he went up there to confront him with whatever proof he had, and Macaulay, with prison looking him in the face, killed the old man. Now don't say we're not sure. It doesn't make any sense otherwise. Well, there he is with a corpse, one of the harder things to get rid of. Can I stop to take a swallow of whiskey?" "Just one," Nora said, "but this is just a theory, isn't it? Call it any name you like. It's good enough for me." "But I thought everybody was supposed to be considered innocent until they were proved guilty, and if there was any reasonable doubt, then—" "That's for juries, not detectives. You find the guy you think did the murder and you slam him in the can and let everybody know you think he's guilty and put his picture all over newspapers, and the district attorney builds up the best theory he can on what information you've got, and meanwhile you pick up additional details here and there, and people who recognize his picture in the paper, as well as people who think he was innocent if you hadn't arrested him, come in and tell you things about him, and presently you've got him sitting on the electric chair." 2 days later, a woman in Brooklyn identified Macaulay as a George Foley, who for the past 3 months had been renting an apartment from her. "But that seems so loose." "When murders are committed by mathematics," I said, "you can solve them by mathematics. Most of them aren't, and this one wasn't. I don't want to go against your idea of what's right and wrong, but when I say he probably dissected the body so he could carry it into town in bags, I'm only saying what seems most probable. That would be on the 6th of October or later, because it wasn't until then that he laid off the 2 mechanics Wynant had working in the shop, Prentice and McNaughton, and shut it up. So we buried Wynant under the floor, buried him with a fat man's clothes and a lame man's stick and a belt marked DWQ, all arranged so they wouldn't get too much of the lime or whatever he used to eat off the dead man's features and flesh on them, and he re-cemented the floor over the grave. Between police routine and publicity, we've got more than a fair chance of finding out where he bought or otherwise got the clothes and stick and the cement. We traced the cement to him later. He had bought it from a coal and wood dealer uptown, but had no luck with the other things." "I hope so," she said, not too hopefully. "So now that's taken care of. By renewing the lease on the shop and keeping it vacant, supposedly waiting for Wynant to return, he can make sure, reasonably sure, that nobody will discover the grave. And if it is accidentally discovered, then fat Mr. DWQ, by that time Wynant's bones will be pretty bare and you can't tell whether a man was thin or fat by his skeleton, was murdered by Wynant, which explains why Wynant has made himself scarce. That taken care of, Macaulay forges the power of attorney and with Julia's help settles down to the business of gradually transferring the late Clyde's money to themselves. Now I'm going theoretical again. Julia doesn't like murder and she's frightened, and he's not too sure she won't weaken on him. That's why he makes her break with Morelli, giving Winant's jealousy as an excuse. He's afraid she might confide to Morelli in a weak moment, and as the time draws near for her still closer friend Face Pepler to get out of prison, he gets more and more worried. He's been safe there as long as Face stayed in, because she's not likely to put anything dangerous in a letter that has to pass through the warden's hands, but now, well, he starts the plan and then all hell breaks loose. Mimi and her children arrive and start hunting for Winant, and I come to town and am in touch with them, and he thinks I'm helping them. He decides to play safe on Julia by putting her out of the way. Like it so far? Yes, but it gets worse as it goes along, I assured her. On his way here for lunch that day, he stops and phones his office, pretending he's Winant, and makes that appointment at the plaza, the idea being to establish Winant's presence in town. When he leaves here, he goes to the plaza and asks people if they've seen Winant to make that plausible, and for the same reason phones his office to ask if any further word has come from Winant, and phones Julia. She tells him she's expecting Mimi, and she tells him Mimi thought she was lying when she said she didn't know where Winant was, and Julia probably sounds pretty frightened. So he decides he's got to beat Mimi to the interview, and he does. He beats it over there and kills her. He's a terrible shot. I saw him shoot during the war. It's likely he missed her with the first shot, the one that hit the telephone, and didn't succeed in killing her right away with the other four. But he probably thought she was dead, and anyhow he had to get out before Mimi arrived, so he dropped the piece of Winant's chain that he had brought along as a clincher, and his having saved that for 3 months makes it look as if he'd intended killing her from the beginning, and scoots over to the engineer Herman's office where he takes advantage of the breaks and fixes himself up with an alibi. The two things he doesn't expect, couldn't very well have foreseen, are that Nunheim, hanging around trying to get at the girl, had seen him leave her apartment, may even have heard the shots, and that Mimi, with blackmail in her heart, was going to conceal the chain for use in shaking down her ex-husband. That's why he had to go down to Philadelphia and send me that wire and the letter to himself and one to Aunt Alice later. If Mimi thinks Winant's throwing suspicion on her, she'll get mad enough to give the police the evidence she's got against him. Her desire to hurt Jorgensen nearly gummed that up, though. Macaulay, by the way, knew Jorgensen was Kelterman. Right after he killed Winant, he had detectives look Mimi and her family up in Europe. Their interest in the estate made them potentially dangerous, and the detectives found out who Jorgensen was. We found the reports in Macaulay's files. He pretended he was getting the information for Winant, of course. Then he started worrying about me, about my not thinking Winant guilty, and why didn't you? Why should he write letters antagonizing Mimi, the one who was helping him by holding back incriminating evidence? That's why I thought the chain had been planted when she did turn it in, only I was a little bit too willing to believe she had done the planting. Morelli worried Macaulay too, because he didn't want suspicion thrown on anybody who might, in clearing themselves, throw it in the wrong direction. Mimi was alright because she threw it back on Winant, but everybody else was out. Suspicion thrown on Winant was the one thing that was guaranteed to keep anybody from suspecting that Winant was dead, and if Macaulay hadn't killed Winant, then there was no reason for his having killed either of the others. The most obvious thing in the whole layout, and the key to the whole layout, was that Winant had to be dead. You mean you thought that from the beginning? Nora demanded, fixing me with a stern eye. No, darling, though I ought to be ashamed of myself for not seeing it, but once I heard there was a corpse under the floor, I wouldn't have cared if Doctor swore it was a woman's. I'd have insisted it was Winant's. It had to be. It was the one right thing. I guess you're awfully tired. That must be what makes you talk like this. Then he had Nunheim to worry about too. After pointing the finger at Morelli just to show the police he was being useful, he went to see Macaulay. I'm guessing again, sweetheart. I had a phone call from a man who called himself Albert Norman, and the conversation ended with a noise on his end of the wire. My guess is that Nunheim went to see Macaulay and demanded some dough to keep quiet, and when Macaulay tried to bluff him, Nunheim said he'd show him and called me up to make a date with me to see if I'd buy his information. And Macaulay grabbed the phone and gave Nunheim something, if only a promise. But when Guild and I had our little talk with Nunheim and he ran out on us, then he phoned Macaulay and demanded real action, probably a lump sum, with a promise to beat it out of town away from us meddling sleuths. We do know he called her up that afternoon. Macaulay's telephone operator remembers a Mr. Albert Norman calling up, and she remembers that Macaulay went out right after talking to him, so don't get snooty about this reconstruction of mine. Macaulay wasn't silly enough to think Nunheim was to be trusted even if he paid him, so he lured him down to that spot he probably picked out ahead of time and let him have it, and that took care of that. Probably, Nora said. It's a word you've got to use a lot in this business. The letter to Gilbert was only for the purpose of showing that Winant had a key to the girl's apartment, and sending Gilbert there was only a way of making sure that he'd fall into the hands of the police, who'd squeeze him and not let him keep the information about the letter and the key to himself. Then Mimi finally comes through with the watch chain, but meanwhile another worry comes up. She's persuaded Gil to suspect me a little. I have an idea that when Macaulay came to me this morning with that hooey, he intended to get me up to Scarsdale and knock me off, making me number 3 on the list of Winant's victims. Maybe he just changed his mind, maybe he thought I was suspicious, too willing to go up there without policemen. Anyhow, Gilbert's lie about having seen Winant gave him another idea. If he could get somebody to say they had seen Winant and stick to it, now this part we know definitely. Thank God. He went to see Mimi this afternoon, riding up 2 floors above hers and walking down so the elevator boys wouldn't remember having carried him to her floor, and made her a proposition. He told her there was no question about Winant's guilt, but that it was doubtful that the police would ever catch him. Meanwhile, he, Macaulay, had the whole estate in his hands. He couldn't take a chance on appropriating any of it, but he'd fix it so she could, if she would split it with him. He'd give her these bonds he had in his pocket and this check, but she'd have to say that Winant had given them to her, and she'd have to send this note, which he also had, over to Macaulay as if from Winant. He assured her that Winant, a fugitive, could not show up to deny his gift, and except for herself and her children, there was no one else who had any interest in the estate, any reason for questioning the deal. Mimi's not very sensible where she sees a chance to make a profit, so it was all okay with her, and he had what he wanted, somebody who'd seen Winant alive. He warned her that everybody would think Winant was paying her for some service, but if she simply denied it, there would be nothing anybody could prove. Then what he told you this morning about Winant instructing him to give her any amount she asked for was simply in preparation. Maybe it was an earlier fumbling towards that idea. Now, are you satisfied with what we've got on him? Yes, in a way. There seems to be enough of it, but it's not very neat. It's neat enough to send him to the chair, I said, and that's all that counts. It takes care of all the angles, and I can't think of any other theory that would. Naturally, it wouldn't hurt to find the pistol and the typewriter he used for the Winant letters, and they must be somewhere around where he can get at them when he needs them. We found them in the Brooklyn apartment he had rented as George Foley. Have it your own way, she said, but I always thought detectives waited until they had every little detail fixed in, and then wonder why the suspects had time to get to the farthest country that has no extradition treaty. She laughed. All right. Still want to leave for San Francisco tomorrow? Not unless you're in a hurry. Let's stick around a while. This excitement has put us behind in our drinking. It's all right by me. What do you think will happen to Mimi and Dorothy and Gilbert now? Nothing new. They'll go on being Mimi and Dorothy and Gilbert, just as you and I will go on being us, and the Quinns will go on being the Quinns. Murder doesn't round out anybody's life except the murdereds and sometimes the murderers. That may be, Nora said, but it's all pretty unsatisfactory.